as an economist, I just find it particularly strange where we're like high price good, low price bad, particularly because we also think, inflation bad, but inflation is higher prices, right?
I hear a little bit more willingness to acknowledge that there is a relationship between supply and demand, which you think should be simple. But I think a lot of people are just really like having an evil villain, and demand is not a good villain. Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffat.
And today we're discussing how rents are down in some, but not all, college towns, and the role played by the government's international student reforms.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. One of the many things I love about working here is that you and me and Meredith are always sending each other articles and wanting to discuss and debate them. An article we all jumped on was by Urban Affairs contributor Francis Bula at the Globe and Mail with the title, Canadian University Cities Facing Surprising Rental Market Downturn, on how in some cities rents are actually falling for student housing. I gotta know, what was your reaction when you saw this piece?
I mean, the first thing I thought was, yay, it's working. And then also followed by, oh, well, might just be a couple anecdotes. And I wonder how real this is. Because I have people in my life who are going to university or their kids are going to university and they're not seeing that kind of decrease. So do you have actual data on that? When do we find out?
Yeah, it's tough. So this goes to the classic Canadian problem that our producer Meredith is always talking about, that Canadian data stinks on these things. There is proprietary rent information at the sort of the neighborhood level, but it's proprietary. Companies hang on to this. There are a few websites that you can get some things from. One of the things I like to do in cities that I'm interested in is I'll actually go to Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace and see what's happening there. So at the micro level, it's hard, but we can get some indication. And it does seem that in many of these college neighborhoods, in fact, rents are going down. We also see that in the big picture data. So we can see, what are rents doing in entire cities, right? What are they doing in London and Vancouver and so on? And we do see even at that level, many cities we're seeing rent declines. And cities that have a lot of internet students and international students. So Brampton, for instance, rents are down about 5% year over year from last year. And that was a big location, particularly for international students, because they would move to Brampton and then go to school in Mississauga or Toronto or Guelph or so on. There are some cities where there are exceptions. Guelph is still going up quite a bit. Parts of Kingston still expensive. So it's not across the board everywhere, but we're not, for the most part, whether it's going to Kijiji or Facebook Marketplace or looking at the big picture data at rentals.ca, we are actually seeing rents decline in many markets. And what we're not seeing is the 15% year over year increases that we saw in 2022 and 2023, particularly in places like London. I rarely have a literal laugh out loud moment when I'm scrolling Twitter, but one of your tweets did it for me. First, you started by quoting the Globe piece, and here it is. Owners are finding themselves having to list them for rents closer to what a family could afford, rather than what 5 desperate students or their parents might be willing to pay. $2,700 a month for a 4-bedroom rather than the previous $4,000. And you had the simple, beautiful 2-word response, "Oh no." I bring this up because I find it interesting how real estate stories are framed. When the Globe tweeted out the article, it was with the caption, Canadian University Cities Facing Surprising Rental Market Downturn. Emphasis on downturn. A downturn sounds like a bad thing, but for students looking for somewhere to live, it's a fairly good thing. Given you and Meredith are my go-to media people, why does the media typically, not always, but typically treat any kind of price reduction in anything as a bad thing?
The first thing to point out is that the person who wrote that headline is definitely not that columnist. And that happens all the time. And being in journalism, you hear it a lot where people will get mad and say, well, why was it framed this way? This headline is like, I hate the way it's written. And really, it's like, well, okay, the writer had nothing to do with the headline. It's kind of a marketing job where they're like, well, we get clicks. And often it works great and represents the article well, but it doesn't always. But I think one other part of it is that in journalism, like you might have a reporter or a columnist who cares a lot about an issue and might want to say, like, rents are becoming more affordable. Great. They have to get it past an editor and often someone who's higher up in the company, who's often been there longer, which means they probably got into housing earlier just based on age. And these are people who, you know, they own property and you have to convince them that it's a bad thing. And I know that it took me like a long time to convince everyone around me in my life that like housing going up as much as it did was actually like not a good thing, because people can feel like they understand like, oh, well, it's really nice. Like, you know, your investment's paying off and I've put time into my home and I've lived here a long time. Why shouldn't it go up 200, 300%? But at the same time, they don't really see the other side. It's hard for them to understand how that can be so painful, especially when I think about the ones who are fairly well off. So like their kids are going to be okay because they'll be able to help them. But that's another point. But I also think like homeowners are more likely to vote. We know that. And so a lot of times that politicians and pundits and all the people who kind of like in some ways set the narrative, they'll often be talking to those people. And I don't have data on this, but if I had to guess, I would guess that the person who's more likely to pay for a subscription to the Globe and Mail is more likely to be a homeowner than not. I don't know that for sure, just a hunch. And so I think that if they want to talk to their audiences, like it is a bad thing when home prices go down to them. It is actually something that they feel more deeply. And there's also the part of it where I'm like, home prices going up, you don't feel that acute pain of it, versus home prices going down. You can picture a situation where someone now all of a sudden has to pay a whole bunch more for their home because they're now underwater. Or you just picture situations where people like, everyone knows what it's like to lose money. And if you know that you've paid something and it's all of a sudden worth less, like people can imagine that right away. But the idea that like price is getting out of reach, it's like, well, those people have been renting. They'll just keep renting for a bit longer and save a bit more. It'll be fine. They don't realize how acute it is for some of those people, and they don't hear those people as much. And so I think that it doesn't react the same way. And I think that the newspapers end up just kind of reflecting how society feels in some ways and also directing it in some ways.
Yeah, no, I could definitely see that, where you know the readership of the Globe and Mail probably is not representative of the population as a whole. But yeah, you know, again, it just seems, you know, and this is not just a housing thing, right? Like we see this in the stock market, right? If stocks go down, we go, okay, well, you know, stock owners are not happy, so on. But you know, you listen to investors like Warren Buffett who say, well, stocks are on sale now. You know, they're cheaper now. Now we can afford to buy more of them. So, you know, this is something I think that transcends the rental or housing market. But again, as an economist, I just find it particularly strange where we're like, high price good, low price bad, particularly because we also think, you know, inflation bad, but inflation is higher prices, right? So it's this weird kind of framing where we really like high prices, but we hate inflation. And I don't know, as an economist, it just hurts my head.
I never thought about that with stock market crashes being seen as entirely a bad thing, because I know that like I was hesitant to invest some money. And then when the stock market crashed in 2020 with COVID, I was like, okay, I guess now's the time to jump in, go, go, go. And it felt like an opportunity, but that's obviously not how it was said, because the vast majority of people probably have some money invested either through their pensions, or through their own personal, their own personal accounts being invested in it. And I think that in general, people see it as for society a bad thing, but there is opportunity there for sure. Although I think it's a little different than housing, where I'm like, we need major changes. We need to have it where it actually is affordable. Like this is actually a good thing for students to be able to afford to live near campuses. That isn't, I don't see how that's a bad thing. It's bad for an individual investor. Like the person that was interviewed in the story was like, yeah, this is hard. And I'm like, yeah, investments with risk, it sometimes can be difficult. Having home prices being lower, like, it actually is not necessarily a bad thing for, and I think that that's something that hopefully people will start considering when they're writing stories. Because I saw Paul Kershaw wrote an article about this where he was talking about a strong market, a weak market, and a strong market's a good thing, weak market's a bad thing. And it's like, or just change it to focusing on the seller's market versus buyer's market side of it. That could be a different way to go about it. Like, for people to be more conscious about that, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, and I like that. Really like that seller's market, buyer's market dynamic. I think we should probably be doing that for the stock market, right? Talking about a buyer's market or a seller's market in the stock market. So, for all you journalists listening out there, if you want to take the advice of two people, only one of which has journalism experience, that would be our note. Let's try and find some neutral language for price changes when we kind of all agree as a society that housing is too expensive. Then it's probably going to have to go down, particularly rents. So if this is the kind of place that we're going to, framing it in such negative language is probably not helpful.
The article, though, that we're talking about suggested that the reduction in the number of international students is what's actually changing things. And can you just remind our listeners, like, what the big changes are by the government? Because I want to know whether it actually is the cause of those decreased prices in these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number of international students until recently was largely determined by the actual institutions itself under provincial law. So, Western or Conestoga College or so on would just decide however many international students they want to bring in. And as long as they met federal requirements, they were allowed to do so. And that shouldn't take the federal government off the hook, because the federal government over the last 10 years, really made it easier to be an international student in Canada. Did things like increasing the number of hours you could work off campus and so on. But this was largely driven by the institutions who brought in a lot of international students to make up for the fact, or at least partly to make up for the fact, that provincial governments weren't providing all that much funding. Well, it got completely out of control, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia. So the federal government kind of decided, like, well, hey, we actually have control over this, right? Because every international student who comes in needs a visa. So they created a cap-like system where different provinces got allocated a certain number of international student visas that they could then allocate to various institutions. And what this meant across the country would be that the number of incoming international students should decrease by about 30% or so, more so in some provinces than others. Now, we don't have great data, again, it's Canada, on what happened this summer, how many international students really did get in, but it sounds like it's going to be at least that 30% decrease, possibly even more. So absolutely, I think this is playing a huge role in this. And I think we also need to make this clear. We're not blaming the international students, right? It's not the responsibility of an international student coming in from Warsaw or Bangkok or wherever to make sure that we have a functional housing system, right? I blame our policymakers. Blame our broken housing system and just our inability to coordinate all of these things together. So that was what's happening on the international student side. Cara, did I miss anything there? I think that was the kind of crux of it.
It sounds like you got most of it. But one thing you've talked a lot about is how you're wondering why so many people are pushing back on you and saying, like, how can this be what actually is happening? And you're like, supply and demand. Do you like? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because one of the things I find really funny about this idea is that a large reduction in the number of students reducing rent would be surprising. And again, noting that Frances did not write the headline and probably did not write the tweet. Those aren't her words. But to my mind, it's the most obvious thing in the world. I'm an economist, and we go, okay, if you massively increase the number of renters in a neighborhood, that's going to increase rents. But it was so weird that I know, like, when rents were going up in college neighborhoods during the international student boom, you had so many people online or even sometimes in the media who would strain themselves, and I would say in good faith, but giving alternative explanations, right? You would hear some saying, "Oh, well, it's Airbnb is the reason why rents are skyrocketing near Fanshawe College in London." Like, as if there's a massive number of tourists wanting to visit East London. And I say that as a former East Londoner. Not happening. Others would say, like, oh, well, it's actually just greedy landlords, which, okay, but that misses the point entirely, because those greedy landlords only have the ability to hike up rents so much because of that surge in demand. So, in my mind, it was the most obvious thing in the world that there was a relationship between rents in college neighborhoods and the number of renters in college neighborhoods, and how it spiked up so dramatically. So again, I got to ask, like, as someone who spends time talking to non-economists far more than I do, why do you think it is that so many people are unwilling to acknowledge the pretty obvious supply and demand dynamics at play here?
I think a lot of people really like villainizing the people who have a lot of money, the developers who are building these places. And so I've seen, especially seen with politicians, have been really hesitant to talk about supply and demand. It took me so long to wrap my head around the fact that there's some politicians who are just never going to say that it's a supply issue. Although there's some have changed their mind. There's some that have really dug in their feet in the past and said, like, supply doesn't really play a role here. Like, it's really about greedy developers. If we can just get them to take less money, that'd be great. And nowadays I hear a little bit more willingness to acknowledge that, like, there is a relationship between supply and demand, which you think should be simple. But I think a lot of people are just like really like having an evil villain, and like demand is not a good villain, or not enough supply is not a good villain. And when the solution is get policies in place that'll make it easier for these wealthy people to make more money, like, that's not an ideal thing, although you need someone to build homes. I think it just becomes much easier to focus on it's really this person. Like, this is the bad guy. And it's not students who are a problem. And I don't think people realize the role that the government was playing. There weren't stories at the time that, like, this is one thing I've heard a lot from, especially for advocates for renters, that when things are bad for landlords, like, you often will get a lot of media coverage, and you don't get the same kind of coverage when it's bad for renters. It has to be really bad for renters to get a story in the media. And I think that that's something that people need to change. Like, they need to realize that, like, there are these dynamics at play here that are actually just basic economic principles of, like, if you don't have enough supply and you have too much demand, prices are going to go up. And they need to focus on that instead of focusing on, like, who can we blame for this? I even see it still, like, when I talk to people, on Twitter or anywhere else where it's just people watching it who maybe aren't experts in it. And they don't like when they hear about, homes that are being built that are going to be expensive, but still the kind of supply that we need. Like, we still need this kind of supply, family friendly apartments. Like, a lot of times I hear people say, well, is it going to be affordable? That's what they'd rather focus on than just supply. And I just keep being like, if there's more of it on the market or less of it on the market, what do you think you have a better chance of being able to afford? And I don't know how they don't come to that conclusion, but it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, I think so as well. Though I would note that many of those same folks, if you tried to put affordable housing in those neighborhoods, would be the first one to scream, right? Because if you put in nice housing in a neighborhood, then it's not affordable, and if you put in affordable housing in the neighborhood, then it changes the character of the neighborhood, and we can't have that. I think a lot of times we really want to look for a villain, and there are bad landlords out there, and there's certainly bad investors out there, and they make for very convenient
And
villains.
bad
But
developers.
and bad developers, absolutely. Or sometimes we even try to make it about sort of evil policy, right? But I look at a lot of this, and I think it's just garden variety incompetence, right? That I think we see bad outcomes, and we go, okay, well, this was done on purpose, and clearly there are evil people doing evil things out there. And I just kind of look at it, and it's like, no, we screwed it up. Like, it's nothing more than that, right? It's just people making these decisions in silos, going, okay, well, the government's not giving me enough money to run my school, so I'm going to bring in a couple thousand international students, and I'm sure the housing thing will work out. And that's somebody else's problem. That's not mine. But I'm sure they know what they're doing, and they will sort this out. And it's so frustrating, right? That, from the point of view of someone trying to do policy, I feel like most of the times we're just looking for the most attractive villain rather than going, okay, how did we get into this mess, and how did we get out of it? And a lot of times there aren't really any attractive villains. It's just people making some really big, good faith errors.
Thanks so much for watching and listening, and thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And we'd love to hear your stories about what it's been like renting a place in a college or university town. So if you have any of those stories, please send us an email at missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.